What if the war in Ukraine isn't about winning or losing, but about survival inside the Kremlin itself? In this video, we're going to look at why Vladimir Putin refuses peace, even when deals offer him apparent victory. We'll uncover the political, economic, psychological, and geopolitical traps that make ending the war riskier than continuing it. From internal fear inside the Kremlin to Russia's growing dependency on China and the ideological threat posed by a thriving Ukraine, we'll explore the hidden forces driving this seemingly irrational conflict. By the end, you'll see why this war persists, not because of strategy or strength, but because peace itself is Putin's greatest threat. There's a geopolitical secret sitting in front of us, visible to anyone who looks closely enough, yet so deeply uncomfortable that world leaders rarely address it openly. The war in Ukraine, now stretching into its fourth year, is not continuing because of battlefield momentum or strategic genius. It endures because of something far more complex and unsettling. On Prime World Connect today, we peel back the layers of an international crisis that has turned into one of the most perplexing political puzzles of the 21st century. A war many predicted would last just a week has transformed into a grinding stalemate, reshaping alliances, draining economies, and redefining global military strategy. And the central question remains, why does Vladimir Putin refuse peace, even when he has offered proposals that would allow him to claim victory in front of his people? To understand the persistence of this conflict, we must take a step away from the dramatic headlines and emotional narratives. Instead, we need to examine the deeper mechanics of how power, fear, economics, and geopolitics interact inside the Kremlin. Because the true obstacle to peace is not found on the battlefield. It sits inside a political system built around illusions that can only survive through conflict. When we explore the forces shaping Russia's decisions, the picture becomes clearer. What looks from the outside like stubbornness or irrationality reveals itself to be a survival strategy for a regime terrified of what peace would expose. The war continues not because Putin expects to win in a traditional sense, but because ending it threatens to unravel the foundations of his rule. The story begins where the world first realized something was deeply wrong, the unexpected longevity of a war that should have collapsed within days. When Russian troops crossed into Ukraine in February 2022, many analysts predicted a swift collapse of Ukrainian defenses. Western intelligence agencies believed Kyiv would fall quickly. Even Russia's own generals expected a short campaign followed by a political takeover. But instead of collapsing, Ukraine fought back with unity, resilience, and a speed of adaptation rarely seen in modern warfare. Entire communities mobilized. Government institutions stayed active. The president refused to flee. European nations supplied weapons faster than anyone anticipated. Ukraine transformed from an underdog into a symbol of defiance, and as it did, Putin's original plan evaporated. And yet, despite these setbacks, the Kremlin kept pushing. Russian losses grew into the tens of thousands. Equipment shortages multiplied. Sanctions squeezed the economy. Skilled workers fled the country. International isolation deepened. But even as the pressure mounted, one constant remained. Moscow would not consider peace. This refusal became even more baffling when reports emerged of a quiet offer from the President of the United States. According to credible diplomatic sources, the proposal included territorial compromises, security guarantees, and a pause on Ukraine's NATO ambitions. For any rational leader in Putin's position, it was a package he could present to the Russian public as victory. By accepting it, he could claim he stopped NATO expansion, secured strategic regions, and protected Russia's national interests. But instead of engaging with the offer, Putin dismissed it instantly. The speed of his rejection left analysts stunned. Why would a leader reject a deal that essentially allowed him to save face? Most explanations offered to the public rely on surface-level psychology. That he is delusional, misinformed, obsessed with empire, or disconnected from reality. But this interpretation misses the deeper and far more dangerous truth. Putin's greatest fear is not losing the war. His greatest fear is peace itself. Because peace would expose vulnerabilities within Russia that the Kremlin has spent decades hiding from its own population and from the world. This is where the idea of war traps becomes crucial. These are not traps in the military sense, but political, economic, psychological, and geopolitical structures that tighten around Putin the longer the war continues. Each trap makes ending the war riskier for him personally. And together, they create a situation where peace becomes the greatest threat to the system he presides over. To understand these traps, we begin with the political trap, the one that sits at the heart of Putin's worldview. For over 20 years, he has built his legitimacy on a single narrative, that Russia is unique, fundamentally different from democratic nations, and incapable of functioning without strong, centralized, long-term rule. He argues that Western-style democracy creates chaos and societal breakdown, and that Russia's stability depends on firm control, limited freedoms, and a constant sense of being encircled by hostile forces. But right across the border lies Ukraine, a country with shared culture, shared history, shared language roots, and similar demographics. And unlike Russia, Ukraine has openly pursued democratic governance, political competition, and integration with Europe. For Putin, the danger Ukraine represents is not geographic or military. It is ideological. A successful Ukraine, one that builds a transparent government, stabilizes its institutions, reduces corruption, and integrates with the European Union, undermines the core justification of Putin's rule. If Ukraine can thrive with democracy, then what excuse remains for authoritarianism in Russia? The comparison becomes even more powerful in a post-war world. A Ukraine rebuilt with European investment would display modern infrastructure, growing job markets, technological partnerships, and rising living standards. Millions of Russians would look at Ukraine and ask why they do not have the same opportunities. This political contrast threatens the foundation of Putin's legitimacy more than any foreign army ever could. This is why the political trap is so dangerous. Peace makes Ukraine stronger, and the stronger Ukraine becomes, the weaker the Kremlin narrative appears. Putin's political identity is built on opposition to the West, and a democratic Ukraine next door is living proof that Russians were denied a different path. For Putin, this is not merely inconvenient. It is existential. Now we move to the second trap, the economic one. Before the war, Russia's economy was diverse enough to support consumer goods, energy exports, transportation, agriculture, and various industrial sectors. But once the war began, everything shifted toward military production. Factories that once produced household appliances now manufacture missiles. Companies that built tractors now build armored vehicles. Small towns depend on defense contracts for survival, and local governments rely on wartime budgets to keep infrastructure functioning. This shift has created a wartime economy that cannot function without the war itself. Military equipment is built to be used and destroyed. That creates an endless cycle of production, repair, and replacement. Millions of Russians now rely on this system for employment and income. If peace arrived suddenly, the economic consequences would be devastating. Large factories would close. Regional economies would collapse. Unemployment would spike. And the Kremlin would face anger from communities that have grown dependent on military spending. Additionally, sanctions would not disappear overnight. Foreign investors would not rush back suddenly. Economic recovery would be slow and painful, exposing the fragility of Russia's economic structure. This economic trap explains why the Kremlin keeps expanding military production even when resources are stretched thin. War, in this context, functions as economic stability. Peace threatens to pull the floor out from under the system. In Putin's calculus, the short-term pain of continuing the war is less dangerous than the long-term shock that peace would bring. But the third trap is even more personal, rooted deep in the internal psychology of the Kremlin. Over the years, Putin has surrounded himself with advisors, generals, and ministers who fear him more than they respect him. This environment punishes honesty and rewards loyalty. As a result, Officials exaggerate successes, minimize failures, and present the president with a carefully curated version of reality. Battle losses are softened. Supply shortages are hidden. Economic data is manipulated. Regional problems are omitted. Everything given to Putin is designed to protect the careers of those who report to him, not to help him make better decisions. Over time, this creates a self-reinforcing illusion. Putin becomes a prisoner of selective information. He believes Ukraine is on the verge of collapse because he is told it is. He believes Western support is fading because reports show curated examples of political divisions. He believes sanctions are ineffective because officials present charts proving the economy is strong. In this environment, the war becomes sustainable only because the truth is kept out of sight. If peace arrives, the truth becomes unavoidable. The real casualty numbers would surface. Economic weaknesses would be undeniable. Corruption would be exposed, and the elites responsible for these failures would fear retribution. This internal fear trap ensures that many around Putin actually prefer the continuation of conflict. War protects them from accountability. Peace threatens to reveal their failures. In such a system, a bad war is safer than a difficult peace. As these traps tighten, the conflict becomes less about territorial control or geopolitical strategy and more about preserving the internal stability of a fragile system. And by the end of part 1, we can already see the outline of a sobering conclusion. For Putin, peace is a direct threat not only to his political survival, but to the survival of the entire elite structure that has sustained him for 2 decades. To understand why the war persists even when military logic suggests de-escalation, we need to explore the final trap that shapes Russia's current trajectory: geopolitical dependency. This factor extends beyond the borders of Russia and Ukraine and reaches into the shifting power balance of the global economy. At the center of this trap stands China, a rising global power whose economic influence has quietly expanded over the past decade. When the invasion triggered unprecedented Western sanctions, Russia lost access to critical imports such as industrial machinery, aviation components, high-tech electronics, and even essential microchips required for drones and communication systems. Major Western companies withdrew, leaving gaps across multiple sectors. To fill these gaps, Russia turned almost exclusively toward China. Today, Chinese manufacturers supply vehicle parts, machinery tools, electronic systems, and even components used for military technology. Chinese companies have benefited enormously from this arrangement, gaining increased access to Russian energy exports and capturing market share left vacant by departing Western firms. China now purchases Russian oil and gas at discounted rates, giving its economy a strategic advantage while providing Moscow with a vital financial lifeline. As Western markets close, China becomes Russia's largest economic partner by a wide margin. Nearly half of Russia's imports now originate from China, and this imbalance gives Beijing significant leverage, even if it does not use it openly. This creates a new geopolitical reality. A war-weakened Russia is far more dependent on China than a peaceful Russia integrated into global markets. This means that China, while not directly dictating Russia's decisions, benefits from Moscow's continued isolation. The longer Russia remains cut off from the West, the more China can shape the economic terms of their partnership. Peace would reduce China's leverage by allowing Russia to diversify its trade partners. For Beijing, a dependent Russia is more predictable and more strategically useful than a Russia free to balance its foreign relationships. This geopolitical dependency puts pressure on Putin. Ending the war might help mend relations with Europe, but doing so risks alienating the country that now sustains his economy. It is a subtle but powerful trap, one that complicates Russia's decision-making in ways many analysts often overlook. A peace that benefits Russia internally might create external complications that weaken the regime's geopolitical position. When we combine all 4 traps, a sobering truth emerges. Putin is not trapped on the battlefield. He is trapped in his own system. Every path toward peace carries consequences that threaten his authority, his alliances, and the stability of his regime. The war continues not because Russia is confident in victory, but because the Kremlin fears what comes after the guns go silent. Inside Russia, this fear manifests in an internal conflict that runs parallel to the physical war in Ukraine. This second conflict is fought through misinformation, manipulation, and an atmosphere of pressure that shapes the decisions of officials at every level. Generals worry that reporting losses will cost them their careers. Economic ministers downplay inflation because acknowledging it might be seen as disloyal. Regional governors hide shortages to avoid being replaced. Even industrial workers feel compelled to demonstrate high productivity for fear of funding cuts. This web of fear creates a distortion machine inside the Kremlin. Putin receives information that has been filtered, processed, and reshaped to align with the expectations of those in power. Maps of the front lines show exaggerated progress. Economic projections assume unrealistic levels of stability. Reports on public sentiment depict a population fully united behind the war effort, even as frustration quietly grows in households across the country. In such an environment, the leadership forms decisions based not on reality, but on the illusion created to preserve internal order. But reality has a way of intruding. Russia is experiencing shortages of skilled labor as professionals leave the country or are mobilized. Industrial output suffers from a lack of specialized components. Inflation continues to rise. Public services such as healthcare and education lose experienced workers. These problems do not explode overnight. Instead, they accumulate gradually. And this is where the system becomes most vulnerable. Slow deterioration can create sudden instability when public frustration reaches a breaking point. Despite censorship and propaganda, domestic discontent is growing. Families worry about the fate of their sons sent to the front. Veterans return with physical and psychological scars. Prices increase, and wages do not keep pace. Everyday life becomes more difficult. These pressures slowly erode the social contract between the government and the population. Yet acknowledging these problems would mean admitting the war has weakened the country. And in a system built on projecting strength, such admissions are unthinkable. This internal environment creates a paradox. The war weakens Russia, but ending the war could weaken it even further. The Kremlin is forced into a cycle where conflict becomes the stabilizing force, even as it drains the country's resources. War sustains the economy. Wartime propaganda sustains the political narrative. Fear sustains elite loyalty. And China sustains the weakened economy. Removing any of these pillars risks collapse. As the internal pressures intensify, paranoia increases. Elites begin to suspect each other. Purges become more frequent. Military commanders are reassigned or dismissed. Intelligence officials try to protect their influence by shifting blame. The atmosphere in Moscow grows darker and more tense. These are the early signs of a political system that fears its own population more than any external enemy. Meanwhile, global repercussions of the war extend far beyond Eastern Europe. Energy markets shift as Europe turns away from Russian gas. Defense budgets increase across NATO countries. Supply chains adjust to new geopolitical realities. Developing nations face rising food prices due to disruptions in Ukrainian and Russian grain exports. The war's ripple effects reach places far removed from the battlefield, highlighting how interconnected the global economy has become. Understanding these implications is vital for anyone trying to make sense of the changes happening around the world. The conflict is not simply about territory or national identity. It is about the evolution of global power structures. It reveals how authoritarian regimes can become trapped by their own internal contradictions. It demonstrates how modern warfare reshapes everything from energy strategy to diplomatic alliances. And it shows that the greatest threat to global stability is not always the most powerful nation, but the most fragile one. The picture is clear. The war continues not because Russia is winning, but because peace threatens to expose political failures, destabilize the economy, unleash internal rivalries, and reduce geopolitical leverage. For Putin and the system around him, the greatest danger is not the battlefield. It is the moment the war ends. Now, the focus shifts from analysis to perspective, examining what this conflict really tells us about leadership, power, and global stability. By understanding the traps that keep Putin locked into war, we gain insight into how authoritarian systems survive, why some conflicts endure far longer than logic predicts, and what this means for the world at large. Inside the Kremlin, every decision is filtered through layers of fear, deception, and survival instinct. The political, economic, internal fear, and geopolitical traps intertwine so completely that no single choice exists in isolation. Each option carries consequences that ripple across multiple dimensions. For Putin, peace is not a victory. It is a risk multiplier. It would expose weaknesses, fracture loyalty, and reduce the leverage he now depends upon. From an external standpoint, this may look irrational, but within the logic of his system, it is the only rational course to preserve control. The war, therefore, is less about Ukraine's territory than it is about maintaining the fragile equilibrium inside Russia itself. In essence, the conflict has become a self-sustaining ecosystem. War fuels stability, stability fuels loyalty, and loyalty fuels the continuation of war. This understanding has profound implications for global strategy. If peace is inherently dangerous to Russia's internal structure, then conventional approaches to conflict resolution, ceasefires, concessions, diplomatic agreements, may be ineffective unless they address the root causes inside the Kremlin. Simply offering territory or security guarantees ignores the deeper structural fears and dependencies that keep Putin committed to conflict. International policymakers must recognize that they are not negotiating with a military machine in isolation. They are negotiating with a system that fears peace more than it fears defeat. Strategies that overlook this reality risk being dismissed outright, or worse, creating conditions that exacerbate the very cycle they seek to end. From a broader perspective, the persistence of this war challenges assumptions about power, influence, and decision-making in authoritarian regimes. The conventional wisdom that states act primarily in pursuit of victory or strategic advantage misses the ways in which survival instinct can override traditional metrics of success. In Russia's case, military setbacks, economic isolation, and international condemnation are secondary to the existential fear of exposing the system's weaknesses. This is a critical lesson for analysts and policymakers worldwide. To understand conflict in the modern era, one must consider not only material capacity, but also the psychological and systemic pressures that shape leadership decisions. The human dimension of this conflict cannot be overstated. Ukrainians continue to pay an unimaginable price for the consequences of a leader's survival instinct. Families lose children and loved ones. Cities endure repeated shelling. Entire generations face disruption in education, healthcare, and social cohesion. Yet, despite these losses, the Ukrainian state has proven resilient, adaptive, and remarkably unified in its pursuit of sovereignty. Their perseverance is a testament to the strength of national identity and collective will in the face of external aggression. It is also a powerful counterpoint to the system-driven fear that governs the Kremlin. While Russia's elites cling to conflict for survival, Ukraine demonstrates that unity and accountability can empower a nation far beyond what external predictions might suggest. For the global community, this war underscores the interconnectivity of modern crises. Energy markets, international trade, military alliances, and technological supply chains are all shaped by decisions made behind closed doors in Moscow. European nations have had to rethink energy independence. NATO has reinforced its eastern flank. China has strengthened its economic influence over Russia, positioning itself as a key beneficiary of prolonged conflict. Even nations geographically distant from the battlefield feel the effects through inflation, commodity shortages, and geopolitical uncertainty. Understanding why the war continues is essential not only for regional stability, but for anticipating and mitigating its cascading global impacts. One of the most striking aspects of this situation is the way illusions and fear create their own reality. Inside Russia, filtered information, selective reporting, and propaganda have produced an environment where leaders believe they are stronger than they are, and where peace is perceived as a threat rather than an opportunity. The longer the conflict continues, the more entrenched these illusions become. This self-reinforcing feedback loop demonstrates a broader lesson about human systems. Decisions are rarely based solely on objective facts. They are shaped by perception, incentives, and the structures that reward certain behaviors while punishing others. In the Kremlin, this dynamic ensures that war remains preferable to peace, regardless of external logic or humanitarian considerations. As we consider the trajectory ahead, it becomes clear that resolving this conflict will require more than battlefield victories or ceasefire proposals. Any sustainable resolution must address the systemic pressures that make peace dangerous for Russia's leadership. This could include mechanisms to stabilize the economy, manage elite loyalties, and reshape geopolitical dependencies in ways that reduce the perceived risk of ending the war. Without such measures, conventional diplomacy may continue to stall, and the human, economic, and political toll will keep rising. Ultimately, the war in Ukraine is a cautionary tale about the hidden forces that drive modern conflicts. It reveals how authoritarian systems, when trapped by fear, illusion, and dependency, can perpetuate violence even in the face of enormous costs. It shows how survival instincts can outweigh rational decision-making and how peace itself can become a threat to those in power. And it demonstrates the profound impact such conflict have on the global order, from energy security and trade flows to military alliances and international diplomacy. The lesson is clear. When analyzing contemporary geopolitical crises, we must look beyond armies and weapons. We must examine the structures, fears, and dependencies that shape leadership behavior. Only then can we understand why wars persist long past expectations, why peace is often rejected, and why seemingly rational offers are dismissed as if they were threats. The situation in Ukraine is not unique in this regard, but it is an especially vivid illustration of how complex, interdependent, and human-driven the dynamics of modern conflict have become. In conclusion, the war in Ukraine is far more than a contest of territory or military strategy. It is a window into the vulnerabilities of a political system built on fear and illusion. The traps that ensnare Putin, the political, economic, internal fear, and geopolitical dependency traps, demonstrate why peace can appear more dangerous than war. Understanding these dynamics is essential for anyone trying to comprehend the persistence of conflict in the 21st century, the fragility of authoritarian systems, and the global consequences that flow from decisions made behind closed doors. For the world, recognizing the forces that prolong war is a first step toward developing strategies that address root causes rather than symptoms. For now, the war continues because ending it threatens everything the Kremlin has built. The battlefield is only part of the story. The invisible battles inside Russia, within the psyche of its leadership, and across global power structures are equally consequential. And until those dynamics shift, we should expect the conflict to endure, with consequences that reverberate far beyond the borders of Ukraine and Russia. If you found this deep dive valuable, make sure to like the video, share it to help others understand the true geopolitical stakes, and subscribe to Prime World Connect for more video breakdowns that reveal the hidden forces shaping our world. The war in Ukraine is far more than a battle over land. It's a window into a political system trapped by fear, dependency, and illusion. Putin's leadership survives only because conflict sustains legitimacy, the economy, elite loyalty, and international leverage. Ending the war threatens to unravel this fragile equilibrium, which is why peace has become the greatest danger. By understanding these invisible forces, we gain insight into the persistence of modern conflicts, the vulnerabilities of authoritarian systems, and the global consequences that flow from decisions made behind closed doors. Subscribe to Prime World Connect for more deep dive analyses uncovering the hidden forces shaping our world.